books. Let me tell you, before we set off here, I want to tell you a little bit about my reading journey. When I was in elementary school, I was an avid reader. I would read all the time. I would read stuff like the Redwall series, A Series of Unfortunate Events, Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. And then by the time I got to college, I was reading mostly plays. I barely touched any novels in that period of time and in my adult life in general. And recently, I've just kind of been thinking about what I might be missing out on in terms of literature. I don't want to die and have never read Moby Dick or, The Grapes of Wrath or Wuthering Heights, all these books that people say are essential pieces of art, because as a fan of art, I think I owe it to myself to have read what are considered some of the great books and then also discover just how amazing literature can be. When I was reading plays, everything was so easy and it was so immediate. You can finish a play in about the time it takes to see a play. It's like around 2 hours or less. But when you're reading a book, it can kind of be a more laborious task. You're not just reading dialogue. You're reading all kinds of stuff. But the medium of books, of novels specifically, is so different than any other kind of medium because every medium of art is different. And I have been trying to seek out books that I think excite me because they're books, not because they're books that I feel like could be stories written for other mediums. So with that in mind, I'm going to be talking about every book that I read in 2022. I set a reading goal for myself this year, which was 5 books, because I really believe in myself. I actually got a lot further than that. I read about 18 books. Some of them are plays. There is a children's book in here. But just shut up. And you might be thinking to yourself, what makes you qualified to talk about books and your opinions on books? What makes you qualified to criticize art? You look like someone who has never been outside. You need a haircut. Your lips are chapped. Even though they're hiding behind the mic, I can tell they're chapped. And I know that you're trying to hide them from me, but you can't. And I will sneak into your house when you are sleeping and I will stab. So without further ado, let's get into everything that I read in 2022. Starting with Marsh is not a swamp. Marsh is a space of light, where grass grows in water and water flows into the sky. Slow-moving creeks wander, carrying the orb of the sun with them to the sea, and long-legged birds lift with unexpected grace, as though not built to fly, against the roar of 1,000 snow geese. Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This is one of the first books I read this year. I had seen a lot of great reviews for this book. It's one of the few more modern books that I read this year. And I basically read it because it was coming out with a movie. And I thought, well, you know what? I'll read the book before I watch the movie. And then I can see which one I prefer. I prefer the book, but the movie wasn't that great. So it's not really saying that much. Okay, my thoughts about this book generally are that it's achingly slow. I was talking to people while reading this book, and they kept saying, just wait till you get to page 100, and then 120, and then 140. And I'm getting to those pages, and I'm like, I do not understand when it's going to start getting interesting. And this is kind of harsh. I did generally like every book that I read this year, and it does pick up towards the end, but it also starts to get kind of sloppy towards the end. The beginning, I just found it to be very repetitive, to the point where it kind of felt like it was trying to shove tragedy in your face and say, care about this. You care about this, right? This is sad. This is sad. It pushed me away rather than drew me in. And I didn't get a real sense of the character's personality. I mean, it's there, but I don't know. It was just, it did not hit me on that emotional level in those opening, at least 130 pages. I think the strongest element of this book is the romance, which is strange to me. I'm not really somebody that cares too much for romance and books or anything like that, but I thought the romance was pretty engaging for me, at least. I mean, that was the part that emotionally felt the most charged and earned. I also thought that the descriptions of nature and of creatures and how they behave and how the animal kingdom behaves. I thought that was well done. And even though it did start to pick up towards the end, it still left me with kind of a bitter taste in my mouth. I still think it's a fine read. I think like most people could probably maybe enjoy this, but it's not something I would honestly recommend because it's just so slow. It's so slow. Anyway, that's where the crawdads sing. Starting off strong. Let's starting off pretty strong. Also, the author killed somebody. I'm sorry, Mr. Bill. Was she calling a long time? Bill shrugs. I can't stop smoking today. I'm sorry. I'm not in a good way today. I'm sorry, Mr. Bill. Next up is Happy Talk by Jesse Eisenberg. This is a play, and I've read every Jesse Eisenberg play that exists. If you don't know, he writes plays. This is his fourth play. I've liked every Jesse Eisenberg play. I think the best one by far is called The Revisionist. It's his second play. The original cast of it had Vanessa Redgrave, which is insane. This one I think is fairly acclaimed from what I remember. The thing is, if you have read other Jesse Eisenberg plays, this follows a very familiar set of themes. All of his plays deal with a foreign character in some way. It's always like privileged people kind of dealing with a character that's outside of Western culture or American culture. A really nice, concise drama. I think it's paced really well and it's very funny. But I feel like there are other Jesse Eisenberg plays that are too similar for me to really love it. If you are familiar with Jesse Eisenberg's other work, it doesn't really do anything different. So it was kind of unfortunate, but I still enjoyed reading it. It was very fast. And the characters are all really good and fleshed out. So Happy Talk. One January day 30 years ago, the little town of Hanover, anchored on a windy Nebraska tableland, was trying not to be blown away. A mist of fine snowflakes was curling and eddying about the cluster of low, drab buildings huddled on the gray prairie under a gray sky. Oh Pioneers by Willa Cather. Willa Cather is someone that I've had on my radar for a while because an author that I like has shouted her out before. So I had this book specifically on my radar. I believe it's part of a Pioneer trilogy of books, and I enjoyed it. It's actually very similar to Where the Crawdads Sing in a lot of ways. One being there's a lot of talk about building things for yourself, being an individual, kind of having your family against you. And it deals with poor families in America. And similarly to that other book, it is also pretty slow. The difference is where I think this book stands out a bit more is I think the writing is a bit better. The prose is beautiful at times. I mean, most of it is descriptions of nature that I think really shine in this book. The story feels more grounded than Where the Crawdads Sing. It feels like it could actually take place in real life. And it's genuinely pretty heartbreaking towards the end. I do find aspects of it to be forgettable for me. While it is an interesting story when I read it, there's not too much that I think about after the fact with this book, and I could just totally be missing all of the layers. I know Willa Cather is a highly celebrated author. You know, people love this book, but there's some aspects of it that are forgettable for me, and unfortunately, that's how I feel. Maybe I'll give Willa Cather another shot, but I still really enjoyed this overall. I just don't remember that much about it. The boy's name was Santiago. Dusk was falling as the boy arrived with his herd at an abandoned church. The roof had fallen in long ago, and an enormous sycamore had grown on the spot where the sacristy had once stood. He decided to spend the night there. The Alchemist by Paul Coelho. By Paulo. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. This is a book that people like a lot, that changes their lives. it didn't change my life, but I enjoyed aspects of it. So this is a story about a boy who goes to become an alchemist or something, and he meets up with an alchemist, and he's trying to do some kinds of things. I don't remember the plot of this book. I remember scenes of this book, but I don't really remember what happens in this book. I'm trying to remember the plot of this book. It's about a boy who's traveling to find, I think they're trying to find the Philosopher's Stone. That could totally be wrong. It's basically a book about making your dreams a reality, not letting your dreams be dreams. You know what I'm saying? Dream face reveal. What? What am I saying? So my issue with this book mostly is that it is so dry. The writing style is basically non-existent. I mean, it's just the story itself is very mystical and spiritual and is supposed to inspire you. At times it really succeeds at that, and at other times it just comes off really choppy and awkward. I think it has a satisfying ending, and it really starts to ramp up in the last number of pages. And it's a short read. I mean, it's easy to get through, but honestly, it kind of feels longer than it is. The descriptions are kind of lackluster. The prose itself isn't that wonderful, and it is translated, I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong about that, but I don't see the name of the translator on here, so I don't know. Whatever the case, it's not like, if you're looking for beautifully crafted sentences, for the most part, that's not really what this is. This is a book of ideas, and it's a book of concepts and of story. Basically, it's basically like a self-help book. Or an inspiration book, a feel-good book, but it's made into this fiction novel, which I think is, in concept, is really cool. I don't know if it does everything super well, but I still really admired what it did do well, and I thought it was really an original story, and the ending was great. So yeah, The Alchemist. Sighs, buzzes him in, opens the apartment door, and leaves, going toward the bathroom. After a moment, Burton comes in. He is tall, athletic, and rather good-looking. He has big feet and big hands that he admires, cracking his knuckles, stretching his neck and shoulders. He is a writer and very interested in his process. He is in a sweatsuit. "Oh, God, darling, I heard 20 minutes ago." "Yeah, it's not been fun. I didn't know if I wanted to let you in. I think if I have someone to cry on, I'll fall apart completely." Burn This by Lanford Wilson is a play that I've been trying to get my hands on for a long time. It was kind of like one of those things that was elusive or out of print or something. For whatever reason, I could never find this play. Then I found this at a local bookstore. I had to pick it up. I finally read it, and I like it. Ultimately, it is a romance with two very broken characters. And the thing that doesn't work for me, unfortunately, about this book is the chemistry between the two characters. I don't really understand why she loves him, other than they're complete opposites. He's kind of this stereotypically masculine guy in a lot of ways, but is also very emotional in other ways. But he's just kind of destructive and awful and borderline manipulative and abusive from what I remember. But where this play really shines is in its dialogue. I think the characters all have distinctive voices. Whether or not I think that the chemistry really works between the romantic leads. I think if I were to see this play done, I would appreciate it a lot more. For right now, like I liked it. It was good, but I just don't know if it worked on me in every level. So those are my thoughts on Burn This. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tuckoo. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This is my first James Joyce book, and I was so curious about Ulysses, but also so intimidated that I decided to pick this one up because it's considered to be a bit more accessible. I know Dubliners is also supposed to be fairly accessible, and for the most part it was. That first section of the book is probably the hardest to read. It was easier to read the thoughts of the characters than the action that was taking place. Like, sometimes I would get confused about where a character actually was, but what's communicated super clearly are the thoughts of the characters. I mean, specifically the main character. You really are inside his head the entire novel. I kind of love this book. I kind of love it. I felt like I related to the main character a lot in this book, maybe more than most books that I've read. And he's kind of going through his own moral battles with art, with religion, with these temptations and these feelings that he's having as a growing boy. And about the concept of salvation. But the book has very long passages about certain topics that it goes very into detail about. And those passages feel so personal because they're explored to such a great extent. And it feels like it's doing justice to a lot of different viewpoints. Ultimately, this is not a book about the plot itself, but it's about the characters' thoughts and feelings. It's definitely not the easiest book to read. And admittedly, every time I thought like, oh, I'll pick this book up and read some, I would read maybe 10 pages at a time, and then I had to put it down because it was just very dense and serious and kind of overwhelming in ways. I don't think I'll be getting into Ulysses very soon. Because I had enough time getting through this book. This book probably, out of the entire list, took me the longest to read. So, would I recommend it? Yeah, absolutely I would. If you're down for the challenge and if you're okay with reading stuff that's a little bit dense. And another thing with this book is that there's so much Latin in the book. Obviously I don't speak Latin. When I started reading the book, I was looking up all the Latin passages, and then I got to a point where I was just like, I'm just gonna not know what this says. I don't want to look up. I don't want to stop the book to look up what I'm reading. And there is also a lot of historical context of Ireland at the time that you either know or you don't, or you look it up. There was one character's name early on in the book, and I just happened to look up the character's name and found out that they were a very important political figure in Ireland at the time. And I'm very glad that I did look it up. But I'm sure there's so much stuff that, like, there are literary references, there are political references, historical references, Ireland-based references, Latin, that I'm totally missing the context for while reading this. So keep that in mind. It's not the most accessible book that a person can read. So, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I did enjoy it, but I feel like I'm just getting pieces of what this book is, which can be kind of exciting. So, yeah. The Antipodes by Annie Baker. This is a play that I don't own. I was borrowing it from a friend, so I can't read the opening, so just watch this.
With every play I write, I'm trying to reassess what it means to watch a play and what we think of as theatrically ordinary or normal. And so I think one of the ways I do that is by picking as the ostensible topic of my play something that sounds like the last thing you'd want to see a play about.
But yeah, this is a strange play. It's a dark comedy. It kind of blends comedy and drama. It takes place in a writer's room where I think they're writing a movie or a TV show, and things start to get very weird very quickly and sort of devolve into strange. It gets really strange. I've read Annie Baker's other stuff, and she's just one of the best, most consistent playwrights right now. This is no exception. I think it's just such an interesting, simple concept, but that's explored so uniquely to her and her writing style. Each character that's in the writing room, it gets into their history, and there are very dark aspects to their lives. Yeah, it's just a great play. I would love to see it. It's very funny. It's kind of Edward Albee-esque because it balances the lines of surrealism and naturalism. It's just a totally enjoyable time and has enough mystery and layers to it that you can probably interpret what's going on in this play in a number of ways. So yeah, the Antipodes, I really enjoyed it. A Few Good Men by Aaron Sorkin is another play that I read this year. I also don't own it, so I can't read the first bit of it. So you can take a look at this.
I want the truth!
I've never seen the movie either. I know it's a huge movie. The play really surprised me. I think for me, Aaron Sorkin can be a little bit much with the little zingers and one-liners, and every character is just brilliant and says the right thing. And I think that his style is unique, and I think sometimes it just works better than others. When one character or a couple characters have that quality, it's a lot more interesting than when every character is snarky and smart. Like The Social Network, one of my favorite movies, and Mark Zuckerberg's character is perfect for that kind of dialogue. But yeah, A Few Good Men was great. It's such a gripping story. I really liked that the main character was kind of, he almost wants to keep himself at arm's length with the case that he's working on. For those that don't know, the play is about, there were these very harsh punishments that were dealt out to certain members of the squad that weren't performing to the level that the Marines should be. I think they're called Code Reds. And so these two guys are ordered to carry out this Code Red, and it ends up killing one of the guys. The higher-ups don't take any responsibility for the death of this guy, and that's kind of, it's a courtroom drama with like military stuff. So well written. It was so fast and just so unexpectedly gripping. And so I can't wait to watch the movie. I think the movie will be probably really good. If it's anything like the play. I thought it was really, really well done. In those days, I thought a lot about jungle adventures and eventually managed to make my first drawing using a colored pencil. My drawing number 1 looked like this. I showed the grown-ups my masterpiece, and I asked them if my drawing scared them. They answered, "Why be scared of a hat?" My drawing was not a picture of a hat. It was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. That's probably not how you pronounce it. I've never taken French, but I think the more that you exaggerate it, the more it sounds like you know what you're talking about. So this is a children's book. You know, I wanted something easy. I read this earlier in the year, and I loved it. It's about this little like alien boy who is just full of light and joy, and this pilot who's stranded on this planet. The little prince, the little boy, is regaling his stories about the different planets he's visited and what that's taught him. It starts kind of formulaic, and that's just one of my small issues with the book, and it kind of works, but it also kind of didn't set the right tone. The first few chapters essentially are the little prince telling about the different planets he's visited, and it kind of just follows this very similar structure. He learns a lesson about how people operate, but that's only a section of the book. That's like maybe the first third of the book. And then the rest of it is the story with the pilot and the little prince and their interactions, and him trying to get off the planet. I will say the book is kind of depressing for kids. I never read this book as a kid. It is ultimately hopeful, and there's a lightness about it, but I don't think I would have picked up on that as a child if I read this. Still a very enjoyable book. I would definitely recommend it. Hi, how are you feeling today? Great, that's just great. This is not my standard greeting, I assure you. I tend towards something a little more formal, a little less inquisitive, such as, say, hello. But it is the standard greeting here. There is some debate as to the correct response to this salutation. Should one reply, I feel good, using feel as a copulative to link the subject I to its subjective complement good, or I feel well, modifying with an adverb the subject's state of being. I don't know. I am a professor of 17th century poetry specializing in the holy sonnets of John Donne. So I just say, fine. Wit by Margaret Edson. This is another play. This is the best play that I read all year. It's about a professor, an English professor, who is dying of cancer. She's starting to reevaluate her life. And the thing about this play that I find really interesting is that it really sidesteps any kind of over-sentimentality right out the gate. The play is mostly monologues. There are lots of scenes as well, but of this very smart woman who is dying, and she's kind of she's balancing in her own mind and to the audience as well. Like the irony of the situation, kind of thinking she can think around the idea of death in a way because she's smarter and has considered a lot more and is very introspective. But in reality, there's not really anything different about death for her than it is about anybody else. It explores death and life in a way that is trying so hard not to make it this very precious, emotional thing. And in doing so, it sort of has the opposite effect where it hits harder because of the restraint that it has. I will say there isn't a lot of action that takes place. This is a very talky play, and that could definitely rub people the wrong way. I don't know if I had seen the play that maybe that would bug me, but as a reading experience, I think it's really good, and I highly recommend it. So, Wit by Margaret Edson. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. He was lying on his back, which was hard, like a carapace, and when he raised his head a little, he saw his curved brown belly segmented by rigid arches atop which the blanket, already slipping, was just barely managing to cling. His many legs, pitifully thin compared to the rest of him, waved helplessly before his eyes. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I don't know what that voice was, but this is a book. It's a very short book by Franz Kafka. It's my first Kafka book, and it's great. It's about a guy that gets turned into a bug. Everybody knows this book. Super, super easy to read. It's a very accessible classic if you're looking for something accessible. Just bizarre. It's super bizarre with very subtle layers to it, and it's very, very interpretable. I don't really have any issues with this book. I don't. I was trying to think of any kind of complaints that I had while reading this book, but it was a really enjoyable reading experience. The only thing that is keeping it from being like higher up on this list is that it just didn't get to the level of what I would consider to be like one of my favorites. Yeah, just punchy, interesting, weird. It's everything that I want from a book, really. People usually didn't say anything when they returned their tapes to the video hut. In a single and somewhat graceful movement, they'd approach the counter, slide the tapes toward whoever was stationed behind the register, and wheel back toward the door. Sometimes they'd give a wordless nod or raise their eyebrows a little to make sure they'd been seen. With a few variations, this silent pass was the unwritten protocol at video rental stores around the U.S. for the better part of 2 decades. Some stores had slots in the counter that dropped into a big bin, but Nevada was a small town. A little cleared space off to the side of the counter was good enough. Universal Harvester by John Darnielle is one of the first books I read this year, and I absolutely loved it. For those that don't know, John Darnielle is the lead singer of the band The Mountain Goats, one of my favorite bands of all time. Just an incredibly original lyricist, and he's also a very good novelist. He wrote a book called Wolf and White Van, which is amazing. It's one of my favorite books. And this one was not as critically well received as Wolf and White Van. This is his follow-up to his first novel. And so I was kind of expecting not to enjoy it as much. I can totally understand some of the complaints with this book. This is not a traditional thriller whatsoever. This is something very different. It's almost like an anti-thriller. It centers around this video rental store in Iowa, and these tapes are being returned, and people say that there's like weird stuff like spliced into the movies. And they try to find the origins of the tapes. Kind of creepy. It's kind of thrilling. You don't really know what's going to happen. It's not a traditional thriller in any sense of the word. And in many cases, it cuts out what could be potentially the most thrilling scenes, which can be frustrating. And there are time jumps where you think, oh, this is going to be crazy when you get to see this scene, but you don't get to see that scene. It kind of cuts to the aftermath of the scene. For what it's worth, I didn't think I was going to expect a straight up thriller from John Darnielle, and I thought I got something a lot deeper and more powerful. And it's a book about grief. It's about memory. It's about legacy and family, and it's a very kind of weirdly haunting book. It's a book that kind of sticks with you in a very untraditional way. And I think because of the way that it's marketed, because of the title, and that this cover is beautiful, but it definitely is going for this very unsettling vibe. It does not deliver on the traditional thriller things that you would expect a thriller to deliver on. And that's kind of what I like about this book. And also just the little character interactions and the things that are very subtle and in the dialogue show so much of a keen observative eye for human conversation and like conversational nuances. Yeah, if you want something that's very non-traditional for a thriller, maybe go with this one. I really recommend it. I'd recommend reading Wolf and White Van first. I think that book is a bit better, but this book did deliver, and it was a lot better than I was expecting it to be. So yeah, Universal Harvester, I recommend. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains, but on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled white, recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This was my very first Steinbeck novel. I never had to read this in school, and honestly had no idea what it's about. For some reason, I thought it was going to be about like the Three Musketeers or something, or that kind of thing. And it's not at all. It's like about the South. These two partners, one of them is a bit slower than the other mentally. They're looking for a job, and they get this job working on a farm. It is absolutely riveting from the very first page to the very last page. It's very lovable characters and also kind of despicable characters as well. It's a bit simple, but if you're okay with simplicity for a classic, this is like, I can't recommend a classic that I think a high schooler would enjoy more than Of Mice and Men. I mean, this is fantastic, and it made me really interested in Steinbeck. And, you know, I'll have to read his other great novels. When the phone rang, I was in the kitchen boiling a pot full of spaghetti and whistling along with an FM broadcast of the overture to Rossini's The Thieving Magpie, which has to be the perfect music for cooking pasta. I wanted to ignore the phone, not only because the spaghetti was nearly done, but because Claudio Abbado was bringing the London Symphony to its musical climax. Finally, though, I had to give in. It could have been somebody with news of a job opening. I lowered the flame, went to the living room, and picked up the receiver. 10 minutes, please, said a woman on the other end. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. This is maybe Murakami's most acclaimed work, although that's debatable. But I decided to start with this one because I liked the cover design, and I thought it sounded really interesting. It's basically about a man who is living with his wife. Their cat goes missing, and there's sort of these strange characters that he encounters looking for this cat, and then his wife goes missing as well. He comes across these ridiculous characters that are very mysterious and sort of talk in riddles. and they're telling their own life stories. He enters dream worlds, and yeah, dreamlike is the key phrase that everyone uses to describe Murakami. Yeah, this book in particular feels like a dream. It's very surreal, but also grounded, and it's super easy to read. That's one of the best qualities that this book has. It's I just tore through it. This is the longest book I read this year by a significant margin. It's around 600 pages, but it's so fun to read for the most part. It's pretty much the complete opposite of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Every time I picked this book up, I'd read like 50 pages. It's just so interesting, and you like to follow all these threads no matter where it takes you. And it takes you in very tangential directions. For me, I'd have to admit that the way this book ended kind of made me reassess the reading experience of this as a whole, because when you're reading it, you're kind of thinking that it's going to conclude in a way that answers all these questions, and I don't think it really does that, which is a little disappointing. The thing that people talk about in regards to controversy for Murakami is his depiction of women, and I totally agree with that. There's like a middle section of this book that feels like every single chapter is like a sex scene or some kind of vaguely sex thing. But for that middle section of the book, it just felt like he got distracted. He got completely distracted telling the story and just wanted to talk about sex for a while. There's this very not great relationship between him and one of the characters. It doesn't really go anywhere too bad, but it's bad enough if this was real life. But again, this is a surrealist work, and it's not like it's totally purposeless, but it doesn't feel totally organic. That's my opinion on this. I really enjoyed reading this book. It's not perfect by any means, but I would totally be down to read Murakami in the future, and I'm planning on reading Kafka on the Shore next year. So what do you guys think about this? What do you guys think about Murakami in general? What are your favorite Murakami books? I'd love to know. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. Let me begin again. Dear Ma, I am writing to reach you, even if each word I put down is one word further from where you are. I am writing to go back to the time at the rest stop in Virginia when you stared, horror-struck, at the taxidermy buck hung over the soda machine by the restrooms, its antlers shadowing your face. In the car, you kept shaking your head. I don't understand why they would do that. Can't they see it's a corpse? A corpse should go away, not get stuck forever like that. I think now of that buck, how you stared into its black glass eyes and saw your reflection, your whole body warped in that lifeless mirror. How it was not the grotesque mounting of a decapitated animal that shook you, but that the taxidermy embodied a death that won't finish, a death that keeps dying as we walk past it to relieve ourselves. On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. Yeah, I read this book. This isn't a classic. This is a contemporary. I read relevant fiction. This is a book by poet Ocean Vuong. I've never read his poetry, but you can very much tell that this is a book written by a poet. Essentially, it's a book written in the form of a letter to the character's mother. They're Vietnamese immigrants, or at least the mom and the grandma. And it's dealing with a lot of subject matter. The structure of this book is very interesting. It goes into, I don't know what's a spoiler and what's not to talk about with this book. I'll just say it explores lots of different complicated relationship dynamics, communication. It is a beautifully written book. In terms of issues I have with the book, Ocean Vuong likes to use a lot of metaphor, and sometimes it is amazing and beautiful and totally just like knocks you out. Other times it can feel a little much. There are times where he's describing the scar on this boy's neck, and he uses probably like 5 different metaphors total for this scar on his neck. Like it looks like a comma that continues on or something like that. And one time was enough. And there are moments where the metaphors could be more visual as opposed to being directly stated as what these images represent in the language of the book. But that being said, this book covers a wide variety of difficult subjects, and has a beautiful emotional core and sincerity to it. I just really enjoyed reading it. I think I don't know what there is to say about this book that hasn't been said already. It feels to me like something of a modern classic, and I don't know much about a lot of modern books, but I feel like this has a bit more staying power than some of the others that I read this year. So, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I hate these little stickers that Barnes & Noble puts on their books, by the way. It's so why would you do this? Why would you ruin the covers of your books by putting this stupid... I know I can get some Goo Gone. I'll get some Goo Gone. What, I need to buy a separate product to just get this stupid sticker off Barnes & Noble? You can't make me any more mad than I am about this sticker right now. This sticker placement actually gives me it gives me a hernia.
It actually wasn't that bad.
Kino awakened in the near dark. The stars still shone, and the day had drawn only a pale wash of light in the lower sky to the east. The roosters had been crowing for some time, and the early pigs were already beginning their ceaseless turning of twigs and bits of wood to see whether anything to eat had been overlooked. Outside the brush house in the tuna clump, a covey of little birds chittered and fluttered with their wings. The Pearl by John Steinbeck. Yes, another John Steinbeck. This was the second one I read this year. Wow, it's so good. It's so short. I mean, look, it's this big, but it's so powerful. It's based on a Mexican folktale. My biggest takeaway from this book is the tension. I read this in basically one sitting. I was so anxious. I was shaking with anxiety. It was that severe. It doesn't feel like a classic. It feels very fresh and immediate. And I know it's not that old. It's not like a Jane Austen book or something. But still, I mean, it's an American classic, and it has it's very simple. It's an incredibly simple book, even more so than Of Mice and Men. I can't imagine any other person telling this story with the power and the punch that John Steinbeck did. The metaphors in this and layers are very easy to pick up on, but that's kind of that can be a good thing, and I think it is for this book. I think it's not going to be the most complex book that you ever read, but it still is totally worth checking out. I think this should be talked about way more in terms of accessible classics. This is so accessible. This is like Whiplash or some thrilling like action movie. It's great, but then it also has that stuff that you can dig into beneath the surface level in regards to capitalism and greed and all of that. So yeah, The Pearl by John Steinbeck. It's just one of my favorites of the year. The American Academy of Emergency Medicine confirms it. Each year, between 1 and 2 dozen adult U.S. males are admitted to ERs after having castrated themselves, with kitchen tools usually, sometimes wire cutters. In answer to the obvious question, surviving patients most often report that their sexual urges had become a source of intolerable conflict and anxiety. The desire for perfect release and the real-world impossibility of perfect whenever-you-want-it release had together produced a tension they could no longer stand. It is to the 30-plus testosteronically afflicted males whose cases have been documented in the past 2 years that your correspondents wish to dedicate this article. And to those tormented souls considering autocastration in 1998, we wish to say, stop, stay your hand, hold off with those kitchen utensils and or wire cutters, because we believe we may have found an alternative. Consider The Lobster by David Foster Wallace. This is a nonfiction book, the first one on this list, and was also one of the first books that I read this year. And it's fantastic. I absolutely Loved it. He makes you care about these subjects that I didn't think I would care about in my entire life. This is a book of essays. It would introduce the topic of an essay, and I'd think, there's no way I'm going to be interested in this. And then I would. And not only would I be interested in the topic and the way that he's writing it, but I would actually feel that what he's talking about is important, even though I don't care about anything that he's talking about. The main one, Consider the Lobster, it centers around the Maine Lobster Festival. It sort of delves into the efficacy of eating lobsters or any animals and kind of the arguments for each thing and kind of disproving some myths about lobsters, but also just really interesting information. He comes from a place of not really having an opinion on the right answer. And if he does have a strong opinion one way or the other, he's very open about it. He's very self-aware. I mean, this book, I think it may have a tendency to over-explain itself in many ways in random points throughout the book. Well, there are some dated elements to this too. It was written in the 90s. And there are some pop culture references that he kind of expects you to know that I just didn't know because I just don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of 90s pop culture, unfortunately. This is probably the best book of essays I've ever read, and I've only read a couple, but it's so good. It's so good. I'd recommend it to anyone that is open to some complex, sarcastic, sort of ironic essay writing that can be sort of esoteric and a bit quirky. The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. Some 70 miles east of the Colorado border, the countryside, with its hard blue skies and desert-clear air, has an atmosphere that is rather more far west than Middle West. The local accent is barbed with a prairie twang, a ranch hand nasalness, and the men, many of them, wear narrow frontier trousers, Stetsons, and high-heeled boots with pointed toes. The land is flat, and the views are awesomely extensive. Horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators rising as gracefully as Greek temples are visible long before a traveler reaches them. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This book is insane. I don't even know what to say about this book. It's by far one of the best books I've ever read. This was also, I think, the first book I completed at the start of the year, and it really set the bar high. I mean, it didn't have any competitor until the last book I read in the entire year, which we'll get to. This is a nonfiction novel. I think it's considered to be the first nonfiction novel, and it centers around these two murderers these two guys that murdered this entire family in Holcomb, Kansas. And it goes into how that affects the people in the town and their views of each other and their views of safety and who they think it is. And it brings about like what their values are as people and how they're kind of all shaken by this insane, inexplicable event. And it is written with so much detail that it feels impossible. It feels like I don't know how he was able to get these details into the book. Maybe he just made a bunch of stuff up. I don't know. Either way, it's incredible. So it goes back and forth between the murderers before the murder and then after. I've seen the movie Capote. It's one of my favorite movies, and so I knew basically what this book was about. But this book goes into so much that's not in that movie. That movie's not really necessarily about In Cold Blood, even though it has a lot to do with the book, but it keeps a lot of the details of the book out of the movie. And every chapter ends with just a banger of writing. Let me read. I'm just gonna read the end of like what the first section, and I haven't read this ahead of time. I don't know what it says. At the time, not a soul in sleeping Holcomb heard them. 4 shotgun blasts that, all told, ended 6 human lives. But afterward, the townspeople, theretofore sufficiently unfearful of each other to seldom trouble to lock their doors, found fantasy recreating them over and again. those somber explosions that stimulated fires of mistrust, in the glare of which many old neighbors viewed each other strangely and as strangers. Are you joking me? That's and there's it literally every single chapter ends with just a banger of a line that just punches you in the face. Only problem I have with this book is that the ending line is not as strong to me and didn't leave enough of an impact as a lot of those other endings that I was mentioning before, and it felt a bit lackluster and kind of a little cheesy, if I'm being totally honest. But still, this is a 10 out of 10 book. I would recommend this to literally everybody. I don't even like true crime. This just completely is the best of any of this genre that I've ever seen. So, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Please read it if you haven't. Jewel and I come up from the field, following the path in single file. Although I am 15 feet ahead of him, anyone watching us from the cotton house can see Jewel's frayed and broken straw hat a full head above my own. The path runs straight as a plumb line, worn smooth by feet and baked brick hard by July. Between the green rows of laid-by cotton to the cotton house in the center of the field, where it turns and circles the cotton house at 4 soft right angles, and goes on across the field again, worn so by feet in fading precision. The cotton house is of rough logs, from between which the chinking has long fallen. Square, with a broken roof set at a single pitch, it leans in empty and shimmering dilapidation in the sunlight. A single broad window and 2 opposite walls giving onto the approaches of the path. When we reach it, I turn and follow the path which circles the house. Jewel, 15 feet behind me, looking straight ahead, steps in a single stride through the window. Still staring straight ahead, his pale eyes like wood set into his wooden face, he crosses the floor in 4 strides with the rigid gravity of a cigar store Indian dressed in patched overalls and endued with life from the hips down, and steps in a single stride through the opposite window and into the path again, just as I come round the corner. In single file and 5 feet apart, and Jewel now in front, we go on up the path toward the foot of the bluff. Toll's wagon stands beside the spring, hitched to the rail, the reins wrapped about the seat stanchion. In the wagon bed are 2 chairs. Jewel stops at the spring and takes the gourd from the willow branch and drinks. I pass him and mount the path, beginning to hear Cash's saw. When I reach the top, he has quit sawing. Standing in a litter of chips, he is fitting 2 of the boards together. Between the shadow spaces they are yellow as gold, like soft gold, bearing on their flanks in smooth undulations the marks of the adze blade. A good carpenter, Cash is. He holds the 2 planks on the trestle, fitted along the edges in a quarter of the finished box. He kneels and squints along the edge of them, then he lowers them and takes up the adze. A good carpenter. Addie Bundred could not want a better one, a better box to lie in. It will give her confidence and comfort. I go on to the house, followed by the chuck, chuck, chuck of the adze. As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner is my new favorite book. This book is absolutely phenomenal. Let me just get into the plot so I can gush about what I love so much about this book. This book is about a trek across Mississippi that this family has to take when the mother of the family dies. And everything that can possibly go wrong goes wrong in that journey. And it's this really harrowing, horrible journey that all of these characters go through. Every character has some sort of complicated relationship with the world, with each other, with Addie, the mom. They just have completely different worldviews. And every chapter of this book is written from a different character in the family's perspective. And it goes back and forth. It's not, one is this long chapter. Most of the chapters are actually really short. And it goes back and forth between different perspectives, and each character has a different way of speaking. Some of them are more literate and able to articulate themselves better than others. One of them is a child named Vardaman, who is basically is almost incomprehensible at times. He has this weird psychological association with his mother and a fish. And if you know, you know. You know what I mean? If you know, you know. This book, let me just... This book is absolutely what I'm looking for in literature. It's about death. It's about families. It's dramatic. It's also funny. It's original. It's experimental. It's nuanced. It's layered. There's so much to love about this book. Immediately when I finished reading this, I was like, I cannot wait to read this again, which I haven't felt about any of these books that I talked about, no matter how much I enjoyed them. And then I went back and I read the first couple of chapters and I had a new appreciation for them. It reminds me of a lot of my favorite plays, because I've always loved the American classic plays, and this is up there with Death of a Salesman, my favorite piece of writing probably ever. This is up there with that, and that's saying something. I mean, this is the last book I read this year, the most recent book that I read this year, and I haven't read anything else because I just want to live with this and there's nothing that's going to compete with this for the end of the year. I just know it. It can be very difficult, but not in a way where you need all of this prior information going into the book, like the James Joyce book that I talked about earlier. It is difficult in a unique way, in a way that the book kind of teaches you how to read it. Like, you don't need to be a scholar to read this book. The book is difficult on its own terms. And in fact, if you are a scholar, it might even make it harder for you because this book has so many run-on sentences. There are aspects to it that are not technically well written, and that's the point. I mean, it's stream of consciousness writing. There are passages that I read probably 8 or 9 times, and I still don't know like 80% of what's being said, but I loved it, and I kept pushing through, and that's kind of the thing with William Faulkner. If you're up for the challenge, it's difficult in a way that leans you in, where you want to know more, where it's mystery and its challenge are part of the charm and part of the fun of this book. I don't know how any book I'm going to read next year will top this. I totally hope I'm wrong. I mean, I'm going to be reading some amazing books this year, probably including Absalom, which I've heard is very difficult. I would recommend this to pretty much everybody, as long as you're okay with sad kind of books, and as long as you're up for the challenge, basically. This book really took me by surprise. This is so right up my alley. I don't expect everyone to like it, but I think everyone should give it a try because it's just something you should experience. It's experimental. It's just experimental enough, but just easy to follow enough to be really anybody's favorite book. So yeah, there you go. As I Lay Dying, it's an incredible book. Everyone should read it. I'm repeating myself at this point. And that's every book I read in 2022. Jeez. I need to sit down for a second. That was a lot of books. If you made it this far, write this down in the comment section if you made it this far. I'm actually losing my mind. I'm losing my mind. I need to sleep. Don't subscribe.